I now have the pleasure of introducing this panel. The discussion we're about to begin focuses on normative questions. We'll begin by considering how algorithmic platforms are changing the way attention is distributed, how culture evolves and spreads, and how we communicate. And we'll get into specifics about what troubles us most about amplification, what values should motivate these platforms. This discussion presents a unique opportunity to take stock of how algorithmic amplification has changed our societies and to advance some visions for a better future. We have three brilliant speakers who will share their thoughts on this today. Annie Dorsen is a theater director working at the intersection of algorithmic art and live performance. Her most recent piece, Prometheus Firebringer, will have its New York premiere in May. And in her spare time, she is completing her second year of law at NYU School of Law. Annie, in addition, is soldiering through a back injury to be here with us today, so she's going to remain seated, and we are doubly appreciative of her making the trek up here. Next, we have Benjamin Laufer, who is a PhD candidate at Cornell Tech. He studies the values and politics embedded in technological systems, particularly those deployed in high-impact, high-complexity domains in the public realm. And we have Seth Lazar, a professor of philosophy at the Australian National University, an Australian Research Council Future Fellow, and a Distinguished Research Fellow of the University of Oxford Institute for Ethics in AI. Annie, would you please go ahead and start us off with your presentation?
Sure. Hi, I'm Annie. Thanks very much to the Knight Institute for inviting me to take part in this, what I'm sure is going to be a really interesting conversation. So this paper arose out of some conversations that Sam Gill and I had about the increasing encroachment of digital logic into the performing arts. Sam is the executive director of the Doris Duke Foundation, so he and I are on like opposite sides of the table from each other quite often. And in the performing arts, you know, people have generally considered themselves to be operating outside of digital capitalist logic and somehow immune to many of the issues affecting other industries. As Sam and I discussed, we thought there were a couple of propositions that seemed vitally important, but that had so far been mostly ignored by members of the arts community. So our audience is really that community, and then further those who are thinking about the logic of digital platforms in a more broad sort of social science way. So for context, this is a period in which arts institutions and artists have been going through a period of intense self-reflection about labor representation, the source of funding, and more. But the assimilation of digital technology into the arts, into its production, distribution, and consumption has hardly been considered. Nonetheless, that assimilation raises critical political and normative questions about the status of the artist, the value of art, and the social role of arts and culture institutions. So we wanted, first of all, to make that case and to exhort our colleagues in the performing arts to take these questions seriously, to regard digital technology not only in terms of audience reach and revenue stream, but also as raising foundational questions about the purpose and quality of art itself. The second idea is that the digitization of the arts can illuminate something about the overall social reorganization we're currently experiencing, which is to say, to the extent we're grappling with how digitization is reshaping our society, its impact on the arts has something to teach us about how this is happening and what the stakes are. So to that end, we want to demonstrate how the logic that prioritizes generating an increasing share of monetizable human attention over all else affects the arts and implants vulnerabilities in other systems of social value. As it has in other contexts, this logic has the potential to degrade or even wipe out institutional systems which were designed to realize and protect important social goods. In the arts context, it operates as a kind of bait and switch. Digital platforms promise the development of new audiences, broader accessibility, and new revenue streams, but they end up producing many of the same damaging outcomes we've seen elsewhere. The reduction of everything into content, the further concentration of corporate control, the erosion of authoritative human discernment, and the intensification of human labor. Now, the capitalist logic of attention capture is neither wholly new nor particularly new to the performing arts. From one perspective, you know, we started it. And that raises the question of whether things online are different by virtue of something about how digital platforms work, or just because digital technology enables the production of so much more of everything. We think there are some ways in which it's qualitatively different, and that taken together, these features of industrial-scale digital production affect a profound shift in how creative expression is organized. Bright lines of intention, which traditionally separate the amateur from the professional, or of audience, traditionally separating producers from consumers, have been muddied. Modes of production have been adjusted according to new ends and imperatives. Traditional authorities have been displaced and diminished. So a key goal of this paper is to locate what we term the missing politics of digital creativity. I mentioned earlier that arts communities and institutions have been going through a period of intense self-examination, and this is a long overdue appraisal of the ethical implications of what we do. But absent from these conversations is any discussion of technology that might be remotely described as political. So we argue that going digital is not merely a mode shift, that to engage in digital creative production is to say something about what art is and what it's for. In the digital sphere, art is content like any other, and its purpose, like all other content, is to generate attention share. The gravitational pull of clickability has proven irresistible in other fields with high professional standards, maybe most notably in journalism. And there's no reason to think the arts will be any exception. As digital platforms colonize the creative fields, the ceaseless drive to prioritize the forms of engagement that maximize human attention share will not only shape how the dance troupe or the ensemble performs in a digital context, but will increasingly influence how their analog prospects play out as well. Because digital and analog existences are now so interdependent, the failure to compete online translates materially in the stature of the creator and their currency in the real-life cultural marketplace. You know, do they have an online following that an in-person venue can hook into? Digital imperatives may increasingly be influencing the art that gets made to begin with. Silicon Valley's perennial promise to democratize access to the means of production has, in the context of the arts, a very specific meaning. Here, to democratize means to make available, at an initially low cost, a set of tools that allow one to participate in aesthetic production toward a predetermined economic and aesthetic destiny. As a consequence, while promising to remedy the elitism, homogeneity, and exclusionary gatekeeping of traditional institutions, digital services may paradoxically subject all artists, from amateurs and hobbyists to outsider artists and professionals, to immersion in and co-optation by corporate-owned digital services that are managed according to their corporate ends, and most definitely not to enable the creative independence of artists. Of course, 20th century commercial media and traditional cultural institutions have also embodied a complex and often contradictory relationship between economic incentives and civic obligations. But the existence of those obligations was at least a topic of both internal and public discussion. When it comes to traditional cultural institutions, somewhere in the inevitably polluted and fraught system of judgments about what constitutes aesthetic quality is a sincere belief in the value of art. Despite everything, cultural institutions are designed precisely in order to support artistic achievement and experience. For the digital platforms, by contrast, the only absolute value is audience engagement. So to state the obvious, these platforms do not exist to promote art. Aesthetic considerations are not even cognizable, much less able to assert themselves. The platforms may present themselves as neutral arbiters, simply reflecting the desires of users who ultimately make the real decisions about what content is amplified or presented. But as long as attention share commands absolute priority over other social goods in the development and operation of these services, there will be risks to aesthetic distinctiveness and to the psychically and materially sustainable production of the arts. So if the time is overdue for introspection and discussion within the arts and culture community about the digitization of the arts, and within the growing community of socio-technical researchers and practitioners about what the arts can teach us about the consequences of digitization more broadly, there are several steps that we think performing artists and cultural institutions can take now to mitigate some of these seemingly inevitable negative impacts. I'll mention just two, because the time is going fast. First, artists and institutions can seek out technology platforms and digital services that align with pro-social values, such as human-centeredness, open source, privacy respecting. There's a growing market of companies explicitly seeking to distinguish themselves from large incumbent operators precisely on the basis of different ethical orientations. Artists and institutions can work to help those initiatives succeed by publishing partnerships, publicizing partnerships, and communicating the reasoning behind their choice of where to put their digital resources. Artists and institutions should also be thinking about aligning their programming and sponsorship choices with those values. This includes considering the sources of funding of technology-related projects, just as one might consider the sources of funding for other programming. If you wouldn't take money from the Sacklers, should you really be taking money from Meta? I'll just end with a couple of questions, all of which are worthy of much more discussion in their own right. So what will enable greater visibility of this missing politics of digital creativity? And how can aesthetic discernment be preserved without aiding and abetting historic systems of aesthetic exclusion? What are morally appropriate forms of engagement with technology operators? When do those operators cross the line from having different but potentially compatible incentives to becoming the Sacklers of digital pollution? And how do we challenge so-called digital disruption at inception, before it's been inscribed into the materiality of the economy? In other words, how can we move more slowly and avoid breaking so very many things? Thank you.
Ben, you want to come up?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Does this work? So I'm going to be talking about a paper that I'm writing in collaboration with Helen Nissenbaum, who's in the audience and who's my advisor, so shout out. So I want to start with an invitation to the audience, which is a question that hopefully will get clarified over the course of this little presentation, which is what constitutes a good knowledge process. And when I say knowledge process, I'm referring to the many varied, long-standing ways that we gain, accumulate, and verify knowledge. So say you come across a post on Twitter that has a piece of information about vaccines and their safety. What would you use to verify that knowledge, or how can you believe that claim? You might use encyclopedias or randomized control experiments. You might use a paper that underwent peer review, textbooks, remembering what you learned in school. These processes allow us to take a claim, say that vaccines are safe, and confidently vet and verify. And so the sort of argument that we want to put forward and the angle that we've been taking on amplification is that at the root of worries about algorithmic amplification is the erosion and deterioration of our collective, trustworthy, reliable knowledge processes. And so now we'll step back and ask what do we mean by algorithmic amplification? And I want to point to two things. The first is that online platforms are increasingly able to determine the reach of posts and content in absolute terms. And the second is that online platforms are able to direct content to particular audiences. And so, of course, there are a huge set of behaviors that might constitute amplification. Any post, any retweet might be described as amplification, and that's a very broad set of behaviors. And within that, we might say that some subset of that large group are wrongful or problematic forms of amplification. Others might be permissible or good. And the sort of two broad questions that this event asks is, what is amplification and what should we do about it? But we sort of want to wedge in the middle and say, actually, in some cases, we might not want to do anything, and in other cases, we might think that algorithmic amplification is causing a huge problem. And so, what's the concern? Over the course of this event and in writing on the topic, you'll see a range of concerns that have been brought up related to algorithmic amplification. So these include polarization, extremism, misinformation, bias and unfairness, autocracy and the imbalance of power, violence. All of these things are pressing and extremely important to talk about and to try to measure empirically, and I commend everybody who's devoted resources towards these topics. But the sort of provocation that we want to make is to say that none of these actually fill the space that we want it to fill when we ask, what are wrongful forms of amplification? These are consequences and symptoms of a system that isn't serving us as a society, but none of these individually can function as a definition that grounds, or a standard that grounds, wrongful instances of amplification. So I'll start by talking about two sort of attempts to define amplification and sort of respond to them, and then I'll give a positive account of what we in the paper argue should be the focus of many of these worries. So the first approach is to use a baseline feed, and we've heard this topic come up a number of times, and I think we'll continue to hear it come up. And the risk is, as you've heard before, that using a baseline feed and defining amplification as the departure from a baseline feed risks sort of covering the harms that exist in the baseline case as neutral and restricting the scope of problems for analysis to only those that arise from the departure from a baseline feed. And that can be overly restricting, and also, not to mention, in cases like TikTok and YouTube, where there's no underlying social graph, things like reverse chronological feeds or other feeds that might be described as neutral are really just irrelevant to the platform, because you wouldn't want to see the last 10 posts that on YouTube, or the last 10 videos on YouTube. They might not be in a language that you speak. So the second sort of approach that we see in the literature is to think of problematic amplification as essentially equivalent to the amplification of problematic content. And we also think this is sort of narrow, a bit of a narrow definition. And so on this, like in this view, there are huge issues in society like bias and extremism and polarization. And there are certain posts that very clearly might contribute to those big problems in society. And in those cases, it's definitely worthwhile to think about content moderation and other strategies, but to restrict an understanding of algorithmic amplification to only finding those problems within content online risks sort of the broader issues at play. And even if we scrubbed the internet of posts that we find deplorable, I'm not sure that's the be-all, end-all that would then solve these broader problems. And Professor Nelson spoke about this nicely earlier, about how algorithms and technologies are a small part of a very networked and broad and complex set of problems. So instead of what we call the content approach, we advocate for a process-oriented approach. And we argue that the issue of algorithmic amplification raises to the level of knowledge and sort of how do we know what we know. And I'll try not to sound overly cliche and meta as I'm talking about this, but we'll see. So most of what we call knowledge is secondhand. You might directly perceive something like the sky is blue, but a lot of the information that we say that we know doesn't come from direct perception, but instead comes from being told that it is so. So you might have learned something in school or read something online. And the internet is a special case where pretty much everything you see, you can be sure that that's secondhand knowledge. And this creates a huge problem that has existed for many, many years, which is, where do we place our trust? How can we be sure that a piece of information is trustworthy and sound? And so over these hundreds of years, we've developed what we call epistemic processes, and we define these as a bundle of norms, conventions, and institutions that are aimed at achieving sound, reliable, and trustworthy knowledge. And over hundreds of years, of course, these institutions and norms are far from perfect and contain a multitude of problems, but they're absolutely essential, and they often are taken for granted. So people don't go around thinking about citation or controlled experiments, but people rely on those practices and those processes to reliably place their trust in certain sources and not others. And so the argument that we want to make is that algorithms for search and for recommendation, among others, have profound implications for our collective knowledge processes, and we need to be thinking at the level of process to understand the potential wrongs and problems that are arising. So when an algorithm is optimized for engagement, for example, we might see clickbait or faulty and untrustworthy claims over claims that, you know, are careful and cite their sources and focus on the process or the source of information. But it doesn't have to be political, or it doesn't even have to be about truth with a capital T. So when an algorithm is based on payment, for example, you might see in a shopping search result worse products that are more expensive than better products that are cheaper, because those products bought their position in a feed. That's an algorithmic logic, and one that we might object to. It doesn't have to do with these like high and mighty principles, but it's just a very clearly a process that is objectionable. So, the sort of million-dollar question here, and one that we're just starting to think about and has been really fun to take this frame, is to ask what norms and procedures and algorithms might bolster and help sound and reliable knowledge production. And examples abound: citation and attribution, participation, some amount of antagonism or debate, some amount of protection of speech. All of these things are norms that we can think of in a broader process for creating a common and shared stock of knowledge. Thank you.
You want to say that? Yeah, sure.
So just before I start, just to say thank you so much to Arvind and to Katie and to everyone at the Knight Foundation for organizing this. I feel sort of heretical because I'm going to start at some point during this. I'm going to start at some point in this, like, slamming freedom of expression as a basis for thinking about these problems. So despite being at the Knight Foundation for the First Amendment. But I want to start with another, with a great American philosopher and a quote from them. Hopefully this will give you, I don't actually have slides. There's a handout at, if you go to write.as, like write as in writing, write.as/Seth Lazar, my name, then you will find the handout. There it is. Yeah, good. So I want to start with a quote from John Dewey, this wonderful American philosopher. Okay, so here we go. The ties which hold people together in action are numerous, tough, and subtle, but they are invisible and intangible. We have the physical tools of communication as never before. The thoughts and aspirations congruous with them are not communicated and hence are not common. Without such communication, the public will remain shadowy and formless, seeking spasmodically for itself, but seizing and holding its shadow rather than its substance. Till the great society is converted into a great community, the public will remain in eclipse. Communication can alone create a great community. Okay, so what's kind of distinctive about this quote? Like, why have I brought it up? The reason is that we kind of need a positive ideal to aim at in all of these discussions. And a lot of what we're doing is instead focusing on the sort of the negatives, the pathologies of the digital public sphere. What I'm going to do in this talk is try and sort of take the other approach and think about like what it is that we should be aiming at. Okay, so on the handout you see there's 11 points. It's a long paper and I'm going to go through it quite quickly. But let's start, right? So the starting point is a descriptive claim, one that many of the different papers that are part of this symposium are affirming, which is that platforms shape communication and they distribute attention. They do this through three particular modalities: the design of the platforms, their moderation decisions, and their curation decisions. Okay, amplification is one type of curation decision. The way in which attention is distributed and communication is shaped is a function of all of these different things. It has to do with like You know, as we've seen over the last week or so with Twitter, it has to do with policies like identity verification, like the format in which you're able to post, whether you have short or long form tweets, for example. Anybody who's got a blue check here, you know, not clicking on that show more link, like no matter how much you've paid. But the design, the affordances of the platform shape how it's possible for us to communicate. The moderation decisions obviously determine what's being distributed, and then curation decisions determine the reach of the things that are being communicated. Now, there's a big question about whether these features of platform architecture, the design, moderation decisions, and curation decisions, whether they're responsible for the pathologies of the digital public sphere, whether they're causing it. It's a really hard thing to figure out, kind of in an almost epidemiological way. But the reality is that, like, whether or not we can actually directly causally attribute the pathologies like manipulation, epistemic pollution, and abuse to these features of platform design, it's pretty clear that they're implicated in the pathologies, that there is a sort of a degree of complicity there. And at the same time, it's also clear that the only way in which we're going to remedy these pathologies will come about through some form of work through pulling these levers of platform design, curation, and moderation. So given that these are the only kind of tools that we have to shape communication and distribute attention, we're going to need positive ideals to aim at. We're going to need to know, like, how to use them better. Like, we're effectively governing the digital public sphere, and so we need a goal, right? But that's like the sort of contentious claim. Like, maybe you could say, no, it's all right, we don't really need positive ideals. All we need to do is go around and figure out all of the distinctive pathologies of the digital public sphere and just kind of whack-a-mole them one by one, like knock them back. So I don't think that's enough for three reasons. One, I think that if you're trying to think about some specific intervention to address some pathology of the digital public sphere, you're often going to need to have a goal in mind in terms of how you actually operationalize that intervention. This is clearly true if you think we're going to try and fix things by shaping recommender systems around better goals, like optimizing for what. Secondly, we're going to have to think about trade-offs, because the different interventions that we make are going to work against one another sometimes. If you have a common goal to aim at, then that gives you a sense of like how you can express those interventions in a common currency. And then the last point is that the nature of the goal that you aim at is going to constrain the means that can be used to pursue it. Right? This is this idea that what justifies limits. You know, the character of what you're trying to achieve determines what you can actually do in order to achieve it. So we need a positive goal, but if you look to political philosophy, you're going to sort of find yourself scrabbling around trying to find what it is that you might aim at. That quote I gave you at the outset from John Dewey, that's not a tradition that has been picked up within political philosophy over the last 100 years. Instead, what you'll find is a lot of work on freedom of expression. Right? That's where people will often go in order to give an account of like how we should redesign platforms so as to better shape communication and distribute attention. And I think this is a mistake, not because I don't think that freedom of expression is important. I think it's extremely important. But I think that it's kind of trying to get a single concept to do too much duty, to kind of work in areas where the concept and the normative ideals that it aims at are not really tailored for that purpose. I think that freedom of expression is best understood as being fundamentally about a kind of right of self-sovereignty, grounded in the fact that we have this sort of unique and unilateral control over how we express ourselves, and that for someone else to kind of impinge on that is a very significant incursion into our autonomy. And I think that what we're dealing with here, when we're thinking about how to shape communication and distribute attention, we're not dealing with the question of like incursions into autonomy. We're thinking about like how do you positively enable people to reach an audience? Like under what conditions do you do that? What kinds of communication do you make feasible? It's a very different question from what we might have in thinking about freedom of expression, which is essentially, you know, what are the limits to the state's incursions into individual speech? Okay, so I think that freedom of expression is the wrong lens to go to here. Some people think that, you know, like freedom of expression has always been about kind of communication as well as just expression. That we've always cared about like the audience that you reach, not only your ability to express yourself. I think that's a little bit of kind of like retconning the history of freedom of expression, but also I think that if we're going to focus on communication itself, we should actually directly focus on it and talk about like what it means to pursue a goal of kind of just communication within a society. So that's where I think we need this ideal of communicative justice. And I'm not going to give you a full theory of communicative justice in the few minutes that remain to me. I'm just going to sort of describe why we need to think about justice in communication, and then I'm going to give you the two types of ingredients that we need in order to build a theory of communicative justice. So why think about this as a matter of justice? And like I've been talking with Jonathan Stray here about this phenomenon of kind of justice creep, where we want to kind of propagate categories of justice in a kind of profligate way. And like one needs to be sort of careful about that. And I think that this is a good case of thinking about justice for two reasons. First of all, one of the questions that we're asking here is how do you distribute attention? Attention is a scarce resource. Questions of how to distribute a scarce resource are fundamentally questions of justice. Second, communication is a collective endeavor. It's something that requires coordination, cooperation. It requires individuals to restrain themselves from pursuing what might be in their own interest in order to achieve greater kind of overall goods both for themselves and for others. This situation where you're trying to achieve these individual and collective goods that you can only get through coordination, where there are benefits and burdens that have to be distributed in the pursuit of those goods, that again is paradigmatically a question of justice. So that gives you a sort of a map to how we can build a theory of communicative justice that can actually provide us with a positive goal when thinking about how to redesign platforms, how to redesign how we shape communication and distribute attention. You need two basic types of ingredients. The first ingredient is the interests that you're aiming at, the goods that you're trying to achieve. Like, what are the communicative goods that are served by a system of shaping communication and distributing attention? And as Ben was just saying, one of those is, for example, knowledge production. But that's not the only thing. We also want the ability to coordinate with others. We want the bare good of sort of individual recognition that comes from being kind of having others pay attention to one, not ignore you. Right? We also want this broader good that Dewey was really talking about of civic robustness, like the ability for publics to come together and hold power to account. Okay, so these are the goods that we're trying to achieve when we're aiming at communicative justice. But this isn't just about kind of taking a particular value and just optimizing for it, irrespective of how you achieve that. Like, it's really crucial not only that you aim for this goal and that you promote it, but that you do so in a way that respects our fundamental moral equality. That's what makes this an account of justice. So in addition to that, we need further norms, like that constrain the pursuit of these goods. There are three different kinds of norms, and maybe in the Q&A we can go into them in detail. I'll just give you the kind of the headline sketch of them. The first kind is the norms of substantive justification. This is what I call the what question. And this is where you take that sort of broader theory of like the goods that you're aiming at, and you ask these kind of questions about how it's going to be distributed, for example. Like, so just as one sort of thought, one of the things that you need to think about in distributing the burdens of communication and collective communication is how we're going to kind of police abuse and misbehavior. Okay, and one thing that you can do is you can rely on people to kind of police things for themselves. So, you know, you can have people kind of block folks who they don't want to hear from online. But obviously that means that those who are most subject to abuse are going to have to bear the greatest burden of actually remediating it. That's obviously not a fair way to go about realizing sort of the communicative values that we're aiming at. Okay, so that's just one example of a distributive question. Another example is, like, how do we achieve something like fair equality of opportunity in the goods that attention brings to people? So, you know, how do you go beyond just kind of this Matthew effect where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer? So those are the kind of the what questions that we need to think about. The next set of questions is really important and that we don't think about enough, especially I think in the sort of in the technical disciplines working on these questions, is the who question, the question of proper authority. Like, who gets to decide how these things are going to be distributed, like what we're going to aim at. Like, it's a really easy question to sort of forget about when you're just thinking about what we're going to optimize for. You just focus on kind of the substantive justification question. But in many ways, the who question is the most pressing. And you know, this ultimately comes down to the question of, do we want private platforms making these decisions about how to realize these communicative goods? On the other hand, do we want states making these decisions when the states are often kind of the biggest threat to individual communication, right, to free speech as well? How can we find some alternatives that kind of split the difference between these two possibilities? Okay, so that's the who question of proper authority. The last question is the how question of procedural legitimacy. Like, how do you go about doing this? I think there's some really interesting insights to be gained from thinking about, like, both the questions of, if you like, textual procedural legitimacy that platforms raise. Like, how should we think about the enforcement of terms of service? Should we think about that through the lens of kind of due process and a sort of private analog of the rule of law? Or should we think about it as through the lens more of like administrative law, for example, and think of it more at the systemic level? But there's also these questions of technical procedural legitimacy. So thinking about the nature of the algorithms that are distributing speech, for example, how we gain insight into them, whether we only want kind of a bare level of transparency like producing the source code for the algorithm as Twitter recently did? Or do we want something deeper, like more access to platform data, a greater ability to do, for example, on-platform tests, like some people at this conference are calling for? Okay, so those are the three kind of elements that we want to aim at to build a theory of communicative justice. On the one hand, you've got the interests that we're just defining, the individual and collective goods that communication aims at, that we want to promote. On the other hand, you've got these norms that constrain it in order to respect our moral equality. The substantive question, the what question, what are we aiming at? The who question of who gets to decide, and the how question of procedural legitimacy. There's way more on that link up there, and there's more in the long paper, but I'll look forward to talking more about this and about the other papers with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you all. These were really excellent papers. So I'm just going to offer a few thoughts, and then I'll start us off with a question for all of you. I really appreciated the way these papers each tried to bring more precision to the concerns we have about algorithmic platforms, how they've changed knowledge production, how they've changed artistic expression, how they've changed communication. And you've also done that without falling back on even implying that the pre-algorithmic era was better or preferable. You all acknowledge that there are problems with that underlying foundation as well, and I think we're going to come back to that a little later. There have been some benefits from the decline of gatekeepers, or at least the gatekeepers we used to have, like a somewhat more inclusive public discourse, the ability to bring attention to one's ideas or work without a built-in audience. And there are plenty of problems with the way culture was influenced and driven or communication took place before the internet took hold. Another thing I really loved is, coming from a law and policy background, these papers made me realize that the conversations I tend to have in my circles around how to change these platforms, how to mitigate their harms or clean them up or whatever it is often really constrained by what we think is possible in the short term. Like we're always trying to come up with solutions within the bounds of the current platforms. And until quite recently, we also gave a lot of credence to what the leaders of those platforms claimed was possible for them to do. We're getting better at challenging them on that, but one thing I was really struck by when I was reading these papers is how important it is to take time to consider what we want these spaces to look like in the much longer term, even if we're not sure what is possible or achievable at this moment, or if what we want is not necessarily possible or achievable right now. So to begin, I think I'm just going to ask you each to share one reaction to your fellow panelists, because I saw you all taking notes as you were presenting. Something about their argument that you want to build on, or something you might want to challenge. Annie, do you want to begin?
I do, yeah. Okay, so I have, this is like a question, right, for Seth. Because I wrote down when you said attention is a scarce resource, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot, is how to maybe get out of the trap of thinking in sort of pre-commodified terms about something like attention. Think rather qualitatively, think not of attention as a resource that could be extracted, could be monetized in some way or exchanged. And I wonder if you have thoughts about that. I love going back to Dewey, and I love this notion of civic robustness and the desire to think about communication as a way of coordinating with others towards common goals. It seems to me that when we think about attention as scarce, we've maybe undone a little bit of that work already by sort of going into a logic, a zero-sum kind of logic, no?
Thank you. Yes, that's a really good question. I'll confess that I've sort of taken on that language in a fairly unreflective way. But I think that the thing that you're describing, of sort of the problem with it, which I completely get, has to do with a background kind of normative framework that goes with the idea of attention as being a resource. Because we can think of things as a resource without that necessarily having these capitalist implications. Right. Like, for example, natural resources that we have common ownership over. Yeah. And I think that the question is, how do we view it in terms of, the sort of humanistic goals that we're aiming at, the collective goals that we're aiming at. And here, this is something I didn't talk about in great detail, but, the goods of attention, they're goods from the perspective of the person who seeks attention, who's speaking. But they're also goods from the perspective of the person whose attention is being allocated. And the goal is to kind of allocate I think it is a scarce phenomenon, resource or otherwise, to allocate it in ways that serve the interests that attention can serve. So in that sense, it's a kind of pro-social goal of enabling kind of coordination, better communication, kind of civic robustness, but also, for you personally, entertainment and enjoyment and better knowledge and kind of the goods of two-way interaction, for example. So I think it's less the notion of it being a resource that's the problem, more the assumption that there's a sort of a kind of capitalist zero-sum kind of profit drive.
Right. Thank you.
Ben, before you offer your thoughts, could you please pass me that iPad so that I can see the audience questions too? Thank you.
Are they writing their questions on the
Yes,
device?
so you can submit questions. If you go to the QR code, you'll go to a Google form, or a little later we'll open up the mics in the audience. Ben, please go ahead.
So I was just going to say, Annie, I loved the paper and the talk, and I thought the sort of interesting connection was when you were talking about the blurring lines between expert and amateur and audience and artist, and these sort of like boundaries are now in question, and I do think that like with technology you have disruption, and then there's a question of norms. Like over time, then the norms start to arise again, and I wonder, like, how do you think about celebrating some ways that those lines are being erased, but while also realizing the like threats to the existing, way of doing things?
Very glad that you pointed that out because I should do this. So yeah, I mean I think what I'd say is like I think I'll speak for myself. Sam's not here. Is that I want to deepen the ambiguity between what professional and amateur means, what insider, outsider means. And unfortunately, I think what happens, is that we lived in a world in which those boundaries were always unstable and always contested, but we all sort of pretended as though they existed in a stable form. Now we know that they've been exploded. That could be a fantastic development. It's not a fantastic development the way it's happening right now, because in a way we're getting kind of the, I don't know if I want to say this, but I wanted to say for a second, like we're getting maybe the worst of both worlds, that we're getting all of the disorientation and the lack of trust and the lack of sort of meaningful communication without the opportunity to like, but also with a kind of like shallowness. So that, is sort of inarticulate. But what I would love to see, thinking about, we don't know how to build the future that we want to see, but I'd love to see the possibility that these disruptions produce like more and deeper ambiguities, as opposed to, more and cheaper things to buy, right? Like,
Thanks.
So I'm going to be greedy and ask you each a question. So Len, I'll do I guess both at once and then have you both respond. Ben, for you, and this in a way goes back to the paper from Tomo earlier. Like I said yesterday, I hate reverse chronological as much as the next person, right? It's and like I said yesterday, it sucks, especially if you live in a time zone that is very different from the time zone of the people you're most interested in hearing from. It is the absolute pits. You wake up in Australia and you're like, well, I've got 8 hours of content to go through. No, thank you. So I don't like reverse chronological, but I do think that there is a sense in which it does constitute a neutral baseline. And I think that there is a sense in which as well there is value in having a neutral baseline. So let me just sort of expand on that thought, right? So it's neutral in the sense of it is content independent. So it doesn't involve making any judgments about the content of the different posts. Whereas any other like algorithmic means does make a judgment. It makes a judgment about how likely you are to like this post based on its content. And I think that's kind of, that's significant. That means it doesn't make a certain kind of value judgment. And that's something that we might well care about. And then why is it useful to know and to have a neutral baseline? Well, ideally because, we want to be able to figure out like, if there's attention being distributed, we want to have a sense of like, what's the quantum of attention that's being distributed by the platform, and what's the quantum of attention that's being distributed by kind of user choice? Because you might think that like, if the attention is being distributed by genuine user choice, then that's kind of legitimated by the fact that it's based on people's free choices. The stuff that's done by the platform, you might say, well, they have obligations to distribute that part. So like in an ideal world, if you could conceptually separate these two out, then it would be, I think, like morally relevant on some pretty plausible theories around fair equality opportunity. So that one will be for you, and I'll do the one for you, and then I can shut up.
Can I take it and then you do the one?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, do it.
Okay, so I think I agree with part of what you said and want to push on another part. So the first is this neutral, and the idea that a reverse chronological feed is content independent. I think that's not true. I think if you have a reverse chronological feed, for example, people might be incentivized, like on the producer side, you might be incentivized to post more and shorter posts rather than longer and individual posts because you want to get to the top of a feed compared to, for example, an engagement-based recommendation. So all of these dynamics are at play, and I don't think it's possible to separate the content from the policy. But the broader point is understood, and I think like my sense on this is if you're an empirical researcher and you're doing a randomized control trial or an audit or something, you have to be reductive. You have to abstract and operationalize concepts in order to measure them. And so in that sense, it's really useful to use a baseline. But if we're imagining what's good and what are good forms of amplification and what are bad forms of amplification, then constraining that inquiry to the departure from a baseline is problematic, and that's sort of what we argue in the paper. But yeah, I think the existence of a baseline for the sake of measurement is totally viable and can be valid.
So I have thoughts, but let me, I'll do the question to Annie. So this is like, you know, in some ways the elephant in the room in any discussion around AI that isn't directly on this topic. Yeah. But especially for creative artists, the rise of generative AI and the ability to kind of just scrape people's work and then reproduce it, leading to these really big questions about copyright. What I wanted to sort of pose to you was that you know, there's a sort of this overlap between our papers. You know, I went through this very quickly in the paper, let alone in the talk. But one of the collective goods that I think we're aiming at with communication is a vibrant creative economy. Yeah. And I think that a lot of artists who I've seen kind of pushing back against things like Stable Diffusion and DALL-E have not been framing things in that way. Instead, they've been framing things in terms of individual consent and copyright. Yeah. And I think that's a mistake. And they should instead be saying, what are we doing to our creative economy here? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. So I'm also writing a large paper about taking a moral rights approach to thinking about generative AI. And for the non-copyright nerds in the audience, basically, from my perspective, going about this through a copyright infringement perspective is like, doesn't fit the actual conduct very well and wouldn't really protect artists very well either right now or definitely not long term. So I completely couldn't agree with you more about that. I don't think that an individualized sort of consent-based approach is going to do very much, and I definitely don't think trying to squeeze like what Stability is doing with artwork into like copyright boxes is I sort of doubt it's going to work, first of all, and then I don't think it would actually redress the harms. So moral rights, I think, would be like from a legally mechanistic way. I think if we could revive that concept a little bit and think about it as in terms of like rights of personhood, that might do more. But I won't get into that. What I really want to say is that I think of these tools as essentially contributing to nihilism. I mean, past the theft of artwork, which is one thing for sure, and past the sort of datafication of things that should not be datafied, and past the shortcuts it allows people to take through the process, which is actually the fun part of making art and the fun part of experiencing it, past like all the thinking that can get produced when you're actually engaging with like another human being who has made something they want you to experience, past all of that, you know, these things are essentially statistical noise in a shape that tickles our eye. So that's like a kind of nihilism of all the things we can say that art can do, and there are uncountable numbers, you know, that's maybe an infinite number. But of all of those things, like for sure, that sort of like meaningless tickling of the eye is one of the least worthy of protection or least worthy of defense. And I'm like an unapologetic sort of Duchampian in this case, that I think like the purpose of art is like the creation of new concepts and the creation of ideas that have tangible sensory form, and not that we're going to make pretty designs or like, look, I made this thing. The sort of results-orientedness of it is appalling to me, on top of everything else. And then these guys, if you listen to what Ahmad Mostak, and sorry, you asked me the wrong question. I could literally talk about this for 3 hours straight. But maybe I just will quiet myself.
Oh, that's great, though.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to take an audience question. If anyone wants to come up to the mics, I'll get to you in just a minute. So this is one that came from online, but I've been wondering about as well, which is, are the norms for communicative justice different in different settings? For example, the norms that are required for social platforms that we might want to see for social platforms, culture and humanities, different than the norms that we might want around sharing ideas for science or innovation. Because in some ways it seems like equal opportunity to attention is exactly what you don't want in the epistemic quality question case, where it's like you don't want anybody to be able to tell you like, what you should do about COVID. You want to listen to the people who actually know that.
Yeah, so I think there's this idea in Michael Waltz's work of spheres of justice, which sort of seeks to keep a sort of a distinct separation between different domains of justice. I think that it's really hard to do this kind of thing just with the internet generally. Everything gets smushed together, and to sort of apply kind of distinct kind of normative principles to different sort of categories of content is super hard. I do think, though, that as far as I think, in principle, a single set of underlying principles should kind of be able to deal with those sorts of cases. Because what you're going for with attention is, on the one hand, you want sort of fair equality of opportunity, and that doesn't necessarily mean that like everybody should get a hearing. It means everyone should have access to a hearing, and then if what they're saying is useful to people, they'll get more kind of attention on that basis. But also in thinking about how we distribute attention, like I said before, it's not only about the kind of the goods of the speaker, it's also about the goods of the audience. And I think that, for example, if you're thinking about scientific misinformation, that obviously is undermining the communicative interests of the hearers. And so, does not kind of merit the same platform as these other things. So I think it's super hard to kind of chunk out particular areas and say, we're going to apply this set of principles here, that set of principles there. But I do think that the same underlying principles should be able to deliver plausible verdicts across those different cases.
I'll just chime in quickly to say, yeah, we thought about this a lot. So if you're using Twitter and you're only following comedians, the type of content that might be amplified because you're using it for comedic entertainment is very different from using Twitter for learning about COVID, what to do about COVID. So, there are different ends. Like, there are the technologies and their uses, and then those uses might be to achieve different ends. And the reason that we kept coming back to knowledge and knowledge processes specifically isn't because knowledge is the only value, but because actually there's something like sort of at the root about knowledge where we lose our ability to point out misinformation, biases, extremism. All of these things rely on having a trustworthy and collectively invested in stock of knowledge and a process. And so, so if that's under threat, then that's a problem, even if the X% of Twitter users are using it only for entertainment. The knowledge the erosion of a knowledge process is a huge problem for society. And that's standalone. But then we can think about other ends and other values that people might get from Twitter, cultural, other types of values that are totally also valid and worthy of consideration.
Great. Okay, let's see if we can get a couple in-room questions in.
Hi, my name is Robert Grimm, and I'm going to try to play an amplification algorithm a little bit and go for emotionally upsetting content. So Annie, I very much appreciate you mentioning the Sacklers because it goes in the right direction of what's at stake here. And in the worst case with Meta, it's 2 genocides so far and counting. And so I wanted to hear a perspective on, because there are probably no representatives of the Rohingya in the room or Tigrayans. And so just what is at stake here?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen, so when I mentioned this to Sam and I said this little thing about like, well, you shouldn't be taking money from Meta, you know, and we've just done years of activism to try to get arts institutions off the Sackler money. And like, you know, when I say this to people, a lot of them have a knee-jerk response, which is that, well, it's not really comparable. And I think it's so nice that you mentioned it, because I think it's... The Sacklers are benign compared to... That's what I think, too. And that seems counterintuitive. That seems really strange, because how can you... But, you know, I think in the US, maybe we have a less complete picture of the impacts of Facebook, for example, outside of the US. And so I feel like there's very serious moral issues with getting entwined with Silicon Valley, full stop, but also in particular with Meta. So thanks.
Okay, over here.
Hi. Hi, my name is Virginia Dignam from Umeå University in Sweden. I have a question mostly for Ben and Seth. I fully agree with your proposal of looking at processes rather than content, and especially your claims of how the current social media and so on erodes the knowledge process. Then it's probably related to what Seth described in terms of the pathologies of the processes and the design of social media platforms. But if we look back at what was the main part of the discussion this morning, the measurement of amplification and so on, how do you think that we need to take measurement of amplification and other pathologies when we look at processes than content? Thank you.
So, thank you for the question. I think measurement is a process,
but it's
so
a kind of a
is,
meta process.
Exactly.
We need a meta
It's
process.
like you can like think about it too long and end up dizzy, but we have all of these ways that we draw conclusions that are reliable and usable and valuable for us. And measuring the spread of problematic content is one very worthy, very important area of inquiry. The point is not to indict those types of studies or approaches, but instead to just take a broad strokes view on the issue and say, if those processes are under threat, then that is an extremely urgent problem, and we should be thinking in terms of how to build the norms and the algorithms and the practices and conventions that allow us to collectively share in our knowledge processes rather than fracturing and ending up in a place where people are relying on different methods and types of measurement and types of understanding, and might end up, causing big problems.
My question was more about measuring your knowledge processes.
So I think there's actually...
Measuring the process.
There's some big methodological questions here, actually, and I think that there's some salutary lessons to take from some of the other papers in this symposium. I think if we're trying to figure out what the degree to which social media is causing these various kind of epistemic and social pathologies, there are these two big kind of approaches, broad camps in which you could describe things. The empirical work is falling. One is essentially kind of big data work on selective content exposure, which strictly speaking focuses just on figuring out who's getting shown what. And then a lot of it comes out of the hypotheses proposed by Sunstein and Pariser you know, Sunstein, first of all, in 2000, in the first edition of the Republic franchise, this guy, I mean, over the course of 17 years, he didn't change his view of what the internet was doing. Like that's, I think, remarkable, especially for someone who's written so much about confirmation bias, right? And he proposed this view about echo chambers. In Paris, there were also 2011, early days, the view about filter bubbles. And so the natural way of approaching that was through this approach of looking at selective content exposure with dodgy data often, like not having access to the data that you really need, and then sort of big questions about coding. I think that a lot of that type of work, there's definitely ways in which it can be useful, but way too much emphasis has been placed on it. The other type of work, which we've had a few examples of in this symposium, so, you know, Smither's paper from earlier, Billy's paper with Molly, work that sort of draws more from psychology and actually looks at sort of engaging with users to see like the effects on them of how they're communicating. That kind of explores the context and the social relations that are being developed through these exchanges online, the traditions that go back to kind of communication studies as well, like Tarleton earlier. Like that I think is where we gain the most insight into how these systems are affecting us societally. And I think it's important to kind of, because often the more quantitative big data stuff is actually kind of trotted out by some of the big platforms. You know, Nick Clegg loves this stuff when he's doing his It Takes Two to Tango thing about you and the algorithm. This type of research can end up being very kind of quietistic. And it can be just like, hey, everything was always messy. It's all messy. You know, don't worry so much. No echo chamber, no filter bubble. But I think that the kind of work that the folks coming more from communication studies and also from psychology are doing really does give us reason to recognize and identify these pathologies. So that's kind of a really important thread that I think that it's great to see this symposium sort of moving forward on.
Okay, we have 2 minutes remaining. Tarleton's going to get the last question.
Okay. Really terrific panel, and I really like the idea of trying to articulate a positive normative goal. I find myself stuck because I want what Annie wants, and I want what Ben and Helen want, and I want what Seth wants. But I also noticed that like a little bit incommensurate, right? The way they frame what is wanted and needed are a little different. So the community of justice does feel Deweyan, sort of like how do people all get together and collaborate civically. The knowledge question is kind of like how does an individual navigate the fact world and maybe with sort of institutions and processes. And then the question about the arts is not just how does the arts thrive, but your question really is like how does a professional community and industry of art get to have the autonomy to thrive? And I want all those things. So I kind of wanted the panel to think about like, is our goal now to just say, let's make a list of the things we want, and we've just named 3 of them. There's probably, you know, a dozen others that we could come up with. Is there a way to name these singularly, or is that a fool's errand? And I want it with a little eye to, because of course we're not dealing yet with how would we convince a particular platform or every platform to take these priorities more seriously. That's sort of the next question. We can leave that for another panel, but if that is the thing that we're imagining, or imagining regulators, or imagining civic society to take it more seriously, whatever, is there a grouping for these that understand them all together? Or is the best thing we can do to say, like, those are 3 really good values, let's put them on the list, and we'll bring this list to whoever?
So I've got thoughts.
Right. Okay, good.
Yeah, so I think I mean, look, I'm a philosopher, right? So I want to see structure, and I want things to have hierarchy and to fit together. So I think, like, in my intention for the value of communicative justice is that it incorporates that Deweyan kind of element of the great community, but that it also recognizes these other communicative goods, including ones that aren't strictly speaking political in the ordinary sort of limited sense of the term. So I really do think that like a vibrant creative economy is a really important communicative good. And I think that, like, you know, one thing I didn't say but that's really important is that, like, the value of communicative justice is not only realized through how platforms shape communication and distribute attention. You know, like, it involves a number of other things that we do societally, like minimally funding public interest media, for example, which isn't straightforwardly something that is something that is done when you shape communication, distribute attention. And I think that, like, the goal of enabling individuals to form accurate beliefs, as well as enabling groups to form accurate beliefs together, kind of agree on those things. These are also kind of part of this overarching value. So I think that, like, there is this big project of figuring out, like, you know, how to fit these different positive normative concepts together into an overarching theory. I think it's worth doing, and I think we see sort of the benefits of doing this, like in other areas of, you know, thinking about distributive justice, for example, where you might have, like, you know, you've got your question about like tax policy here and your question about like, childcare here. And like they're both like, they're sort of different political issues that draw on different values in one sense, but they can both be sort of underpinned by an overarching theory of distributive justice. And I think that kind of goal is where I see this going with communicative justice. That's kind of the aspiration for it. That's just me.
Any quick last thoughts from either of you?
I think this positive question is like the one that lingers in my head. It's like, how do we think about, especially institutions, I've sort of clung to even as just a word or as a concept, because we've been for a while now with new technology finding that like all these problems with our institutions and fundamentally questioning whether they should exist, and that's a really good and exciting thing. But then, hopefully we can move towards like imagining what comes after, and that's like it's fun to be on a panel that's sort of thinking about that. But yeah, I think that there's still a lot of conversation to be had.
Yeah, I'll just maybe add like in 2 seconds that one of the things that I think a lot about is this notion of sort of AI abolition, which I'm borrowing from Melody Dinser, who's probably borrowing it also from others, but she's been doing some interesting research on this notion. And the idea, of course, is that the technology, that AI is a tool to be developed when we have a problem that we want solved, when there's a community need for these tools, that we develop technology in order to achieve certain specific goals, rather than create a technology and then like go around searching for things that we could use it for, or imposing it on communities and creating a need for it economically or otherwise. And so, this is going to be a little, I don't know if I get to quote this, but it's in my mind all the time, so I will, which is this like ending of Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Masks, about like, making sure that the tools should never possess the man, right? And I think that's a wonderful way of thinking about what an ethical approach to tools are, that we don't want to get possessed by them. We don't want to get owned by them. Yeah.
Okay, that's a good closing note. Thank you all for the excellent discussion. Thank you.